The Imperial Japanese Navy's Kaga was a one-of-a-kind aircraft carrier that not only helped define the role that such naval vessels would have in maritime warfare, but also performed as one of the greatest Japanese naval assets in World War II. Built initially as a battleship, Kaga would eventually be transformed into one of the first full-fledged aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Its size, armor, and weapon systems were unique compared to Allied carriers and gave the Japanese ship an advantage when engaging in ship-to-ship battles, even when that became rarer for carriers as the war evolved. For Japan, Kaga was crucial in developing aircraft carrier doctrine and outlining the warfare strategies that would give them the massive early victories they achieved, including its central role during the Pearl Harbor attack. However, as the end of the war approached, the unique carrier found itself cornered and surpassed by American military might, and in a fierce encounter during the Battle of Midway, Japanese Fleet Commander Chuichi Nagumo was forced to make a devastating decision. From battleship to carrier. Kaga was designed to be a Tosa-class battleship and was initially launched on November 17, 1921 at the Kawasaki shipyard in Kobe. A few months later, the two Tosa-class ships built by Japan were revoked and prepared to be scrapped under the terms of the recently signed Washington Naval Treaty, which severely restricted the size of naval vessels to prevent an armament race that could lead to another global-scale war. However, the treaty allowed the conversion of two giant battleships or battle cruisers that broke the pact rules into aircraft carriers of up to 34,000 tons. The unfinished battle cruisers Amagi and Akagi were initially selected, but the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 damaged Amagi's hull massively, and Kaga took her place. The official pronouncement to convert Kaga to an aircraft carrier was issued on December 13, 1923. Still, work didn't begin until 1925 due to another earthquake damaging the naval base where the modifications were to take place. The ship began a trial period to test her seaworthiness on March 31, 1928. After succeeding, she joined the combined fleet under Commander Rengo Kantai on November 30, 1929, as the Imperial Japanese Navy's third carrier to enter service. After the significant modifications, Kaga measured 782 feet from stern to bow. She had a 103-foot-long beam and was able to displace 27,300 tons of water at standard load and 34,234 tons at full load, nearly 6,100 tons less than her design displacement as a battleship. Kaga was manned by a total of 1,340 crew members. Two aspects made her aesthetically and functionally unique: the three superimposed flight deck disposition and her exhaust vent system. Then, as the ship was transformed into a carrier, the ejection of exhaust gases became a particularly delicate issue. The Japanese tested two possible fixes. One was used on Kaga and the other on her sister Akagi. Kaga's system consisted of two long horizontal ducts that discharged gases at the rear of each side of the flight deck. The system was built despite predictions by several naval engineers that they would not maintain the hot gases away from the deck. The naval architects were correct, as the gases would not evacuate the ship efficiently, thus making Kaga slower than Akagi. Furthermore, the gases would often rise and interfere with landing operations, and the heat would make the cruise quarters on the side of the ship almost uninhabitable. Besides the infamous Japanese exhaust vent system, the ships were constructed with three superimposed flight decks that gave the vessels their unique look. No other ship in the world used three flight decks. The primary flight deck was 561 feet 8 inches long and 100 feet wide. The middle flight deck was 49 feet 3 inches long, and her lower flight deck was approximately 180 feet 5 inches long. The decks were supposed to provide significant versatility, as lighter rescue aircraft could take off from the smaller ones, and larger combat ones could use the large landing platform. However, the middle deck was too small even for the lightest aircraft to take off, rendering it almost useless. The issue would become even more significant as World War II dragged on, with the addition of heavier and larger aerial fleets. When completed, the ship had two main hangar decks and a third auxiliary hangar, with a maximum aircraft capacity of 60 air vehicles. In addition, she was powered by four Kawasaki Brown Curtis geared steam turbines, with a total of 91,000 shaft horsepower, able to move the vessel at a maximum of 32 miles per hour. Kaga was armed with 10 third-year type 20cm 50 caliber guns, one twin-gun Model B turret on each side of the middle flight deck, and 6 armored casemates in the rear section. The decision about which weapons to fit into Kaga was made when aircraft carrier doctrine was still in its earliest stages. Hence, priority was given to guns that would perform better against ship-to-ship combat, while not providing enough anti-aircraft coverage. Vulnerability to aircraft attacks was partially improved during the second phase of significant reconstruction. in which 6 twin 4.7-inch 10th-year type Model A2 guns were added, and the 3-deck configuration was replaced with a single large deck. To achieve this, the 2 old decks were converted to hangars, allowing Kaga to carry over 80 combat planes. However, the supposed improvement backfired, as the new deck design obstructed the anti-aircraft gun's full range, preserving the carrier's vulnerability to airborne assaults. Early combat. Kaga's early combat experiences occurred during the Sino-Japanese War, in which the aircraft carrier was used against a technologically inferior naval force. The encounters with Chinese troops were limited to small dogfights, where the superior Japanese planes would often come up victorious. The carrier was also used to deploy aircraft strikes to disrupt Chinese supply lines and railroad tracks, providing Japanese air forces with a comfortable air superiority during their extended campaigns on Chinese territories. The Japanese soon became overconfident in their carrier's capabilities, as they could deal devastating destruction in a short time while not suffering significant damage from counterattacks. However, Japan could not grasp the seriousness of their carrier's flaws, specifically their crippling anti-aircraft performance that would soon make them an easy target for Allied airborne attacks. Although Kaga provided remarkable firepower, it lacked an early warning system and an active radar. To make matters worse, the communication systems were rudimentary, and the still developing carrier doctrine didn't consider adequate protocols to deal with incoming aircraft attacks. Mark Petey, a Japanologist specialized in modern Japanese military, would call the Japanese carrier force, quote, a glass jaw. It could throw a punch, but couldn't take one. Pearl Harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor would extend the Japanese Navy's confidence in their carriers, including Kaga. On November 17, 1941, under the command of Captain Jisaku Okada, Kaga was armed with 100 torpedoes at Saiki Bay in Hiroshima. These specially designed torpedoes had been constructed to perform in the shallow waters of the Pearl Harbor waterfront. 2 days later, Kaga and the rest of the combined fleet strike force under Chuichi Nagumo assembled it at Horofu Island. The fleet then departed on November 26th and furtively crossed the Pacific while avoiding trade routes. Kaga was a crucial part of the attack on Pearl Harbor, as the vessel carried 18 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, 27 Nakajima B5N torpedo bombers, and 27 Aichi D3A dive bombers, plus 3 crated aircraft of each type. On the morning of December 7, 1941, these aircraft were part of the first strike force to attack Oahu, amounting to 1/5 of the total aircraft that attacked the Hawaiian base. The aircraft that took off from Kaga claimed hits on Nevada, Oklahoma, Arizona, California, West Virginia, and Maryland, while the Japanese fighter pilots claimed to have destroyed 21 American aircraft. After the strike, all 6 Japanese carriers withdrew from the area and returned to Japan. For Kaga and her crew, the day had been a colossal success. Midway. For the following months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese war efforts were highly successful, and they were able to capture extensive resourceful territories in Southeast Asia while keeping the Allied superpowers at bay. Still, the Japanese Empire knew that it was only a matter of time for America's unparalleled industry to assemble a massive fleet that could overwhelm them. The Japanese then thought of launching another surprise attack on U.S. soil and finishing off their Pacific fleet, specifically their aircraft carriers. That could be enough leverage to force their enemies onto the negotiating table and achieve peace before they could build more vehicles. However, the remaining U.S. carriers in the Pacific were stationed in heavily defended Pearl Harbor, so Japan would need to lure them out and destroy them. A surprise attack on the U.S. base at Midway was then planned, and a fleet consisting of 4 of Japan's most important aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with several destroyers and cruisers, departed from Japan and spread out across the Pacific to reduce the chance of being discovered, traveling to Midway in complete radio silence. However, despite all their efforts, the American troops cracked their communication code and were aware of the incoming attack almost a month before it happened. The naval battle that ensued would become one of the most consequential encounters in World War II. After the deceptive first phase, where the Japanese seemed to outmaneuver all American attempts to sink their carriers, the mighty Japanese Zeros providing the defense to the Japanese fleet ran out of fuel and ammunition. U.S. commanders took advantage and launched a massive airstrike that finally disabled 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers. Kaga was hit by 4 huge bombs and was soon engulfed by uncontrollable fire. Captain Jisaku Okada immediately perished with the initial strike, and the fires spreading through the carrier trapped most of the crew below deck, making it impossible to escape. Fleet Commander Chuichi Nagumo then made the difficult decision to scuttle the 3 damaged carriers using torpedoes. Thus, Kaga was finished off by her own comrades, while hundreds of sailors were still trapped in it. U.S. forces would soon disable Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, marking an utter defeat for Japan. 811 Japanese sailors ultimately lost their lives aboard Kaga, and the surviving minority were taken back to Japan and quarantined for almost a year in a desperate effort to prevent the Japanese public from learning about the disastrous defeat. Instead of forcing America to reclaim peace, Japan lost a colossal part of its primary attack force during the battle, and the Empire was forced to fight a defensive war from then on. America's confidence was bolstered, and the war's outcome was written. Thank you for watching my video. What do you think of Kaga's role in World War II? Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you don't want to miss more amazing historical content, subscribe to our Dark Documentaries channels, and don't forget to hit the notification bell.